Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the United Kingdom is effectively sleepwalking into a collapse that will fundamentally change what it means to live in this country? And how would you react if you knew that this decline isn't an accident, but the mathematical inevitability of decisions being made right now? The United Kingdom currently stands at a precipice facing a convergence of economic, social, and geopolitical failures that threaten to unravel the fabric of the nation. For most of the past decade, the political discourse in Britain has been dominated by optimistic slogans about rebuilding, renewing, and restoring the nation. However, beneath this rhetoric lies a starkly different reality. The country is moving rapidly toward a trajectory of managed decline defined by a full-scale militarization strategy, a crumbling industrial base, and a standard of living that is collapsing for the average citizen. To understand the gravity of the situation, one must look beyond isolated headlines and view the crisis as a systemic failure rooted in decades of strategic mismanagement that has left the United Kingdom exposed to a series of cascading catastrophes. To truly grasp the magnitude of this situation, we must first examine the current fiscal landscape and the stagnation that has taken hold of the economy. The most immediate manifestation of this decline is the profound stagnation of the British economy. Despite the current government's insistence that wealth creation and economic growth are their primary objectives, the data suggests a complete disconnect between political rhetoric and economic reality. For the past 15 years, the British economy has essentially flatlined. Since 2007, the gross domestic product per person in the United Kingdom has increased by a distinctively meager 7%. Even more concerning is the state of productivity, the ultimate driver of long-term prosperity. Productivity growth in the UK has increased by just 4% over this period, a figure that ranks as the absolute lowest among the G7 nations. This stagnation is not merely an abstract economic concept, it is a lived reality for 60 million people. We are witnessing a historical anomaly where real wages today are lower than they were in 2008. For 17 years, the average worker has seen their purchasing power erode, leaving them poorer now than they were nearly 2 decades ago. This creates a psychological and financial pressure cooker as the promise of upward mobility. The idea that each generation will be better off than the last has been effectively broken. Instead of addressing these structural issues through investment and modernization, the fiscal policy of the United Kingdom has shifted toward a new aggressive form of extraction. Chancellor Rachel Reeves sits at the center of a new economic dilemma, presiding over the imposition of some of the heaviest tax burdens in generations. Despite entering office with promises of moderation and protection for working families, the government has unveiled a set of tax-raising measures that will stretch all the way to the year 2031. These measures are estimated to extract roughly £26 billion, equivalent to approximately $34 billion from British citizens. Critically, this tax squeeze is not being levied primarily against multinational corporations or the ultra-wealthy, but falls squarely on the shoulders of the 1.7 million middle-class families who are already grappling with a cost of living crisis. The overall tax burden is projected to reach 38% of the gross domestic product, the highest level in modern British history outside of the 2 world wars. This creates a perverse incentive structure within the economy. High marginal tax rates, which can reach effective rates of 90% or more for certain income brackets due to the tapering of benefits and student loans, are actively disincentivizing work. Hundreds of thousands of citizens are choosing to cap their salaries or reduce their working hours because the fiscal system punishes ambition. But how did the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution arrive at this state? To answer that, we need to look back at the historical root causes, specifically 2 economic phenomena, often referred to as curses, to understand how the United Kingdom arrived at this state of stagnation. One must look back more than 45 years to record tax burdens, the resource curse and the finance curse. The term resource curse is typically applied to developing nations that discover abundant natural resources, but subsequently experience slower and less equitable growth than their peers. However, this dynamic applies perfectly to the United Kingdom's management of North Sea oil and gas. From the late 1970s and early 1980s, Britain enjoyed a massive windfall of hydrocarbon wealth. Unlike Norway, which prudently invested its oil revenue into a sovereign wealth fund to secure the future of its citizens, the UK government, under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, chose a different path. This windfall was used to fund immediate tax cuts for the wealthy and to sustain the mass unemployment caused by deliberate deindustrialization. The influx of oil revenue artificially inflated the value of the pound sterling, pushing it well above its natural competitive rate. This strong currency acted as a poison pill for British manufacturers, making their exports prohibitively expensive on the global market. The government effectively burned the nation's future to fund a neoliberal experiment, dismantling the industrial fabric of the country in favor of short-term financial engineering. As the oil revenues began to dwindle, the economy pivoted to a new dependency, replacing the resource curse with the finance curse. The economy became dangerously reliant on the City of London and the influx of hot money speculative capital flowing into the UK to take advantage of high interest rates and lax regulation. The Big Bang of 1986 deregulated the financial markets, prioritizing rent extraction over productive labor. This shift created a network of tax-haven satellites, places like Jersey, Guernsey, and the Cayman Islands that facilitate the flow of capital through London without necessarily benefiting the wider British economy. The dominance of the financial sector has continued to keep the pound overvalued, further punishing what remains of the manufacturing base. Moreover, it has led to extreme regional inequality. Wealth has centralized in London and the southeast, while industrial hubs in the north, Wales and Scotland, have been hollowed out. Their economies devastated by a lack of investment and the deliberate offshoring of production. The direct consequence of these historical choices is that the United Kingdom has effectively forgotten how to make things, leading to a severe decline in manufacturing and industrial capacity. A nation that once built ships, forged steel, and pioneered engineering marvels now primarily exports financial claims and services. Key industrial sectors, including shipbuilding, steel production, textiles, and electronics, have been largely eliminated from the domestic economy. This has resulted in a structural trade deficit. The UK consumes significantly more than it produces. To bridge this gap, the nation relies on selling off its assets to foreign buyers, a practice euphemistically labeled as foreign direct investment. In reality, this often amounts to the selling of the family's silver infrastructure companies and real estate to fund current consumption. Compounding the difficulty for any remaining industry is the exorbitant cost of energy due to a combination of policy failures and a dogmatic approach to net zero targets without sufficient baseload capacity. British industry pays 63% more for electricity than competitors in France and 27% more than those in Germany. Household electricity prices are among the highest in the world, literally double what ratepayers in the United States pay. This makes the United Kingdom an unattractive environment for heavy industry or energy-intensive manufacturing, accelerating the exodus of productive capital to countries with more rational energy policies. However, the situation facing the United Kingdom today is not merely a single economic downturn. It is defined by a convergence of 6 simultaneous crises. These crises feed into one another, creating a doom loop from which there is no easy escape. The first crisis is economic stagnation. As previously noted, business investment in the UK is the lowest in the G7. Capital flight has accelerated to alarming levels. In the year 2025 alone, it is projected that 500 millionaires and approximately 91.8 the finance cursed billion in wealth will flee the country. The contrast with Poland is particularly stark. 2 decades ago, the UK was 4 times wealthier than Poland. Today, thanks to Poland's 30 years of uninterrupted growth, lower taxes, and pro-investment policies, it is on track to overtake the UK in GDP per capita within a decade. The second crisis is demographic collapse. The birth rate in the UK has fallen to 1.49 children per woman, well below the replacement rate of 2.1. At the same time, the population is aging rapidly. Currently, there are roughly 3 working-age people for every pensioner. That ratio will approach 2:1. By 2050, it could near 1:1. This demographic math makes the current model of the National Health Service and the state pension system mathematically impossible to sustain. The only theoretical solution, net immigration of roughly 1 million people per year every year indefinitely, is politically untenable and socially volatile. The third crisis is infrastructure decay. The physical skeleton of the nation is crumbling. The privatized water system loses 30% of its supply to leaks before it even reaches homes. While Victorian-era pipes collapse underground, the road network faces a backlog of repairs estimated at £14 billion. The rail system is plagued by aging trains and outdated signals. While the flagship high-speed rail project HS2 has been cut back so severely it may never reach its original destination. Perhaps most critically, the National Health Service faces a maintenance backlog of over £11 billion, with hospitals literally deteriorating to the point of being unsafe for patients. The fourth crisis is social fracture. British society is fragmenting along regional and economic lines. The inequality is so profound that a child born in the impoverished town of Blackpool has a life expectancy 10 years shorter than a child born in the affluent borough of Westminster. A gap one might expect between developing and developed nations, not within 2 distinct postcodes of the same country. Trust in institutions, the police, parliament, the media has collapsed. Crime, particularly violent crime and theft, is rising, leading to a feeling of lawlessness and the emergence of a two-tier justice system where the wealthy rely on private security while the rest of the populace is left unprotected. The fifth crisis is energy vulnerability. Since the year 2000, North Sea oil and gas production has declined by 75%. The UK has shuttered its coal plants and allowed its nuclear fleet to age without timely replacement, leaving the grid dangerously exposed. The country is now a massive net importer of energy with no control over global prices. Furthermore, the transition to renewable energy is hampered by a total lack of domestic supply chains for critical minerals like lithium and copper, leaving the UK dependent on geopolitical rivals for its energy security. The sixth crisis is geopolitical isolation. Following the exit from the European Union, the UK lost friction-free access to its largest trading partner. Trade has declined and investment from Europe has fallen. Simultaneously, the special relationship with the United States is waning as American strategic interests pivot toward Asia. The UK military, once a formidable force, has atrophied to its smallest size since the Napoleonic Wars. The Royal Navy struggles to maintain ships, and the Air Force faces recruitment crisis. The UK is increasingly a medium-sized power negotiating from a position of weakness, isolated from Europe and marginalized by the US. Amidst this crumbling domestic picture, we must also address a baffling and controversial shift in strategy, the government's sudden pivot to militarization. The United Kingdom is racing to push its military budget to at least 2.5% of gross domestic product by April of 2027. This move aligns with demands from NATO and pressure from the United States. Yet, it raises serious questions about fiscal priorities. Unlike previous buildups funded by economic growth, this militarization is being financed directly by the British taxpayer through the largest tax squeeze in history. This effectively represents a massive sixth converging crisis, redistribution of wealth from the pockets of the middle class directly into the military-industrial complex. What makes this shift particularly disturbing is the lack of transparency. The government has offered almost no concrete explanation to the public regarding the necessity of this sudden ramp-up. There have been no specific intelligence releases or evidence of imminent attacks on British soil to justify such a scale of spending. Instead, the justification relies on vague generalities and what critics describe as fear-mongering. This policy creates a dangerous feedback loop. As the UK ramps up defense spending and positions military assets aggressively near Russian borders, it contributes to a new arms race that destabilizes the region. Billions of pounds are being funneled into military projects and backlogs for defense contractors, while the social fabric of the nation, its schools, hospitals, and transport networks continues to rot. For the individual citizen, however, this macroeconomic decline is felt most acutely in the housing market and the general standard of living. The housing market has transformed from a ladder to prosperity into a mechanism of wealth extraction. In London, the average house is now worth 14 times the average person's income and a staggering 35 times the yearly minimum wage. This disconnect has rendered home ownership a mathematical impossibility for the vast majority of young people. The rental market offers no refuge. Renters in London now spend approximately 41% of their gross income just on rent. When other unavoidable housing costs such as council tax, heating, and electricity are included, that figure rises to above 60% of income. This leaves almost no disposable income for savings, investment, or participation in the wider economy. Government policy has arguably exacerbated this crisis. Under the guise of renters' rights, the government has introduced legislation and tax changes that target individual mom and pop landlords. By removing tax relief on mortgage interest for individuals while leaving it in place for corporations, the government has forced many small landlords to sell up and exit the market. This reduction in rental supply has driven rents even higher. Meanwhile, massive corporate landlords and private equity firms, often foreign-owned, are exempt from these punitive measures, allowing them to consolidate control over the British housing stock. This brings us to a critical, often overlooked dimension of the crisis, the erosion of competence and the betrayal of the social contract, which has triggered a great exodus of talent and hope. Beyond the dry statistics of GDP and inflation lies a more visceral failure, the collapse of competence within the British state. For years, the government has relied on forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, to justify its fiscal rules and borrowing. Yet, these forecasts have proven to be consistently, almost impressively wrong. On average, the OBR has overestimated economic growth by 0.9% per year. This may sound like a margin of error, but when compounded over a decade, it represents a catastrophic misunderstanding of the nation's economic trajectory. We are being sold a narrative of recovery based on phantom growth that never materializes. The government uses these overly optimistic predictions to gaslight the financial markets and the public, insisting that wealth creation is just around the corner while simultaneously enacting policies like the highest tax burden in history that actively strangle that very creation. This is not merely incompetence. It is a form of institutional dishonesty designed to protect political careers at the expense of national reality. The result of this betrayal is visible in the departure lounges of Heathrow and Gatwick. We are witnessing a quiet but devastating exodus of the young, the ambitious, and the skilled. For generations, the United Kingdom was a magnet for talent. Today, it is becoming a net exporter of its brightest minds. Doctors, engineers, and entrepreneurs are voting with their feet, moving to Australia, the United States, Dubai, or Singapore. Places where hard work is rewarded rather than penalized, and where the basic infrastructure of daily life actually functions. Perhaps the most humiliating indicator of this decline is the reversal of fortunes with Eastern Europe. 20 years ago, the Polish plumber was a stereotype of the British labor market, skilled workers moving from a poor economy to a richer one. Today, that dynamic is inverting. Since 2008, the UK's GDP per capita has grown by an average of just 0.7% a year. Meanwhile, Poland has enjoyed the longest uninterrupted period of economic growth in European history. The data is sobering. 2 decades ago, the gap in wealth between a British citizen and a Polish citizen was vast. Today, if current trends continue, future managed decline, Poland is forecasted to overtake Britain in GDP per capita within the next decade. Why? Because while Britain was busy inflating property bubbles and strangling its economy with red tape and high taxes, Poland was liberalizing its economy, lowering taxes to spur investment, and resisting the urge to fund a bloated welfare state with money it didn't have. This is the starkest indictment of the UK's trajectory. When a country that was ravaged by imperialism and communism for a century is on track to become richer than the birthplace of capitalism, it is a sign that the UK's economic model is fundamentally broken. The ambitious young people of Britain see this. They see a housing market they can't enter, a tax system that punishes their success, and public services that don't work, and they are drawing the only logical conclusion. Leaving this brain drain is the final nail in the coffin of future growth, stripping the country of the very people needed to rebuild it. So where does this leave us? We must look ahead to the future outlook, weighing the likelihood of managed decline against the possibility of radical reform. Looking ahead, the next 5 years present a grim trajectory. The convergence of the 6 crises described above suggests that the United Kingdom has entered a phase of systemic collapse. This is not likely to be a sudden Hollywood-style event, but rather a gradual grinding degradation of daily life. By 2026 and 2027, we can expect to see a wave of local council bankruptcies forcing the closure of libraries, parks, and youth services. NAS waiting times will likely hit new record highs, pushing more people into a private health care sector they cannot afford. The first major infrastructure failure, be it a regional power blackout or a critical water shortage, is a distinct probability by 2028 and 2029. The economic reality will likely precipitate a severe recession, triggering a sovereign debt crisis or a currency crisis that forces a return to brutal austerity measures, this time cutting into the core bone of the state rather than just the fact. By the early 2030s, the social contract may be pushed to its breaking point, with civil unrest becoming a common feature of British life. There is theoretically an alternative path. A program of radical reform could reverse this trajectory. This would require the establishment of regional public investment banks to fund a reindustrialization strategy similar to the model used successfully in Germany. It would require a total overhaul of the monetary system, ending quantitative tightening and setting interest rates to benefit the domestic economy rather than foreign capital. It would demand a strategic shift away from the hot money finance model toward an economy that values production, making things and essential services like care and education as true productive assets. However, the political will for such radical transformation appears to be entirely absent. The current political class remains wedded to the failed dogmas of neoliberalism and the primacy of the financial sector.